This is the second in a series of perhaps 15 videos talking about the top books for understanding crime, the psychology of crime, and especially the on-fire genre of true crime. The next video will talk about two books by the esteemed Columbia psychologist, criminologist Michael Stone, whose Anatomy of Evil gives a pretty spot-on survey of contemporary thinking about psychopathy and sociopathy, and develops his famous and conspicuously Dante-esque 22 Degrees of Evil, which loosely mirrors the structure of Dante's Circles of Hell in the Divine Comedy. The first group, after justified homicide, covers impulsive murders and those who aren't really psychopathic or sociopathic. The middle of the scale is those who have some degree of psychopathic tendencies, general grandiosity, superficial charm, glibness, manipulativeness, deceit, callousness, lack of remorse. But it's the number 17 to 22 where we're really in the hell broth. And there we are dealing with the true psychopathic person with true evil, especially those involved in sexual, serial homicide, or torture. It's a grim place to look at, but I find his sort of ranking scale absolutely fascinating, and he applies it to specific crimes and specific criminals. His book is huge, and I totally recommend it if you have one single book that you want to use as a sort of broad reference to understand the psychology of psychopathy, the nature of crime, the history of crime, current crimes. I think it's absolutely fascinating. Just as he modeled the 22 Degrees of Evil roughly after Dante, I think he modeled the whole title of the book and its format on one of my favorite works of literature of all time, and that is Robert Burton's Renaissance Anatomy of Melancholy, in which Burton tries to sound every possible nuance and cause and diagnosis and symptom and aspect of melancholy, which at the time was a broader term. It really refers to some sort of psychological dis-ease, depression, some lack of fit between self and world. And it is an exhaustive and fun and fascinating book. And I think that was, first edition came out in 1611, I think. It's been a lot of centuries, but I think that Michael Stone's The Anatomy of Evil is a sort of fit follow-up to Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. Anyways, Stone's next book is fabulous too, and called The New Evil. And in addition to pretty much surveying the field, he argues that there have been some pretty grim changes since roughly 1965 in the nature of evil when it comes to violent crime. I think I love it, but I disagree about a lot of the particulars. I'm more of a historian fascinated with 16th and 17th century, and I'll tell you, for true crime, that was some pretty grim stuff. If you want a measure of that, look at the Newgate calendar, which is all about home butcheries and dismemberments and cannibalism and really weird stuff. We aren't alone or unique in our tendency for human evil to express itself in mayhem and things which cause a great deal of human suffering. Now, last video was a discussion of Ann Rule's book, The Stranger Beside Me, which stands out because an ex-police officer and someone at the time writing true crime articles for her newspaper met this absolutely charming, wonderful, kind, empathetic, sensitive, psychologically astute young man who was her colleague at a crisis center, which really suicide prevention hotline. And Anne thought he did a wonderful job with the phones and talked people down from suicide. And she liked him and really liked him a lot. And she, for the rest of her life as a crime writer, had to deal with the fact that this young man she was smitten by turns out to be none other than Ted Bundy, who now we know at the time was creating havoc and mayhem and killing people and destroying lives left and right. But today, I want to explore a couple key works that have greatly expanded our collective understanding of sociopathic and psychopathic behavior. I want to start with one that goes way back in time. This is 1886. This is Richard von Krafft-Ebing, his book Psychopathia Sexualis. And Ebing was a doctor and sort of a precursor to a psychologist, but Ebing noticed how many of his patients, some of whom were in hospitals for the criminal insane, were plagued absolutely with some sort of massive sexual obsession or dysfunction. And over the course of 20 years, he took case histories from hundreds and hundreds of patients. And this is basically his uncensored case history, factual account of sexual, aberrant, violently sexual behaviors in the 1870s and 80s. And it's fascinating sort of contrast to our own cliche vision of Victorian times, which is staid and obsessed with politeness and decorum and that kind of thing. But one thing you see is there's nothing new under the sun. The second thing you see is within the range of sexual behaviors and whatnot, there has always been this incredibly wide range. Most of it spills towards the beautiful and towards intimacy. Some of it spills towards the highly destructive, psychotic, psychopathic, etc. The second jumps back in time a bit too, and it's a fascinating book because right now you look at the internet, look at YouTube and stuff, and it sounds like we're just only now discovering malignant narcissism as a huge root of massive amount of human destructiveness. Or we're discovering this sort of fact that the neighbor might be the one who's wearing the mask, or you peel back the secret theater of home and see, instead of some Barbie existence that it seems to be from the outside, some sort of literally Ken and Barbie homolka or something on the inside, and masks a tremendous amount of mayhem. But I love the title of his book, The Mask of Sanity. And it came out in 1941, and Mask of Sanity, of course, is nothing new at all. Shakespeare again and again was talking about people being deliberate in their dissimulation. Richard III declaring in the first time he appears, "I am myself alone," and then rejoicing in the fact that he has basically severed the bonds of compassion with absolutely everyone, and goes so far as that he can outcolor the chameleon. It's kind of add colors to the chameleon, and he can smile and murder while he smiles. And he really takes a great love, not just in causing mayhem, but in being the smiling one. He does it, people thinking that he's all that, and smiles in their faces. The best single formulation of the Mask of Sanity when it comes to psychotic or sociopathic behavior is not from Shakespeare, and it's not from Sheckley. It's from Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, in The Cask of Amontillado, where his character says, "The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You who so well know the nature of my soul will not suppose from moment I gave utterance to a threat, I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, nor did he know that my smiling was at the thought of his immolation." That formulation, smile in his face, nor did he know that my smiling was at the thought of his immolation, which of course means to light someone on fire, or metaphorically to totally destroy them, rend a human being into total ashes, destroy utterly their life into nothingness. Smile and smile, nor did he know my smiling was at the thought of his immolation. So what you have, though, in Sheckley in 1941 is an anticipation of so much more recent critical theory by people like Robert Hare in his Psychopathy checklist and whatnot. But I think it's interesting to look at something that, 1941 is now, 81 years ago. And what does he do? He has a whole chapter on superficial charm, which is, just kind of harrowing, because it sounds like all the people who are charming us at business or charming us in terms of relationships and whatnot. And he does something very interesting about his definition of the sociopath, and say the sociopath lies not only because they get what they want by lying, but the truthfulness simply does not register as a value for them. And Sheckley takes a sort of extreme opinion on some things, that some qualities like truthfulness or empathy or really love simply do not exist for him. Now, his largest thing he calls not narcissism, but he calls pathological egocentricity. And I actually prefer this to narcissism. I think it's a fabulous phrase, pathological egocentricity. And he writes that if someone is afflicted with pathological egocentricity, there are all these absolutes, right? They do not experience love. It's not only that they want to, or there's still some manipulative strain within the love. They simply do not, on a basic experiential level, maybe even a neurological level, have a real capacity for love. And that extends to the familial, it extends to the romantic, it extends to the parental. And he suggests and said that psychopaths are terrific at impersonating love and affection. But at core, these things just aren't there. They can't be learned, and it's really not a treatable condition. I'm haunted by this because I've thought in my own work it's a kind of zero factor at the end. We're always trying to push sort of character and cause into things, but what if the zero at the bone, the zero factor in the middle, is really something substantial? You can fake it, but at core, it simply does not exist, right? That's Sheckley. 1941, big long book. I love, as a fan of literature, I love the chapter where he's talking about fictional works in terms of light that they shed on our understanding of psychopathy. It's an interesting read, but it is very, very long. So I am not recommending that as a complete read, but it's got some points. Now I want to talk not about true crime, but two fictional works which really change the way that we think about true crime. One is absolutely fabulous work, The Killer Inside Me, which came out as a pulp fiction paperback in 1952. And this is important because in the 50s, paperback originals could get away with stuff either in terms of dealing with sort of hinky topics or marginal topics, or things which would ordinarily be subject to self-censoring by censoring by the larger publication houses. And so what you see in the 1950s is a lot of writers sort of cutting their teeth on this in this uncensored medium where they could write about sexuality, they could write about human depravity, they could write about morally offensive topics without feeling a continual desire to self-censor themselves because their books would be rejected or slashed and burned by an editor or standard publishing thing. It's a fascinating thing to look at what some of the 1950s pulp fiction was able to achieve. Only a quarter. And this is a marginal note, but it did tremendous ethical good in some corners. For instance, if you were a gay or lesbian in the 50s, where do you go? To the well of loneliness, the 50-year-old books? There wasn't much that was out, so to say. However, you could go to your local drugstore and there would be, within the 25-cent thing, along with hard-boiled crime and things, there would be books about lesbiana, about gay people. You wouldn't find any of that in standard publications. So it's kind of an interesting thing. The second book is by Patricia Highsmith, and she is one of the great crime writers of all time. She lived in this sort of shadow world of underground and psychopathy. It was kind of her home as a writer for the most part. Did some fabulous works. But Patricia Highsmith does Strangers on the Train, where a perfectly rounded, nice guy who's just a little bit tired from a bad relationship and whatnot meets a total psychopath. Psychopath tries to convince him that if you wanted to commit a murder and get away with it, the thing to do is find a partner, and each person kills the person the other person wants dead. And so there's no possible way of linking them back. And through this sort of weird machinations, it actually happens, right? But to get back to Jim Thompson, hard-boiled pulp writer, The Killer Inside Me. First, you have this fabulous fabulous title, right up there with Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment and Raskolnikov and whatnot. But the protagonist of The Killer Inside Me is this Texas deputy sheriff named Lou Ford. And if you meet Lou Ford in a restaurant, you will just think he's the nicest guy you ever met. New waitress sees him and says, "Why, you're not even carrying a gun." And Lou Ford answers him, "Why would I possibly need a gun? I always found if you're nice to people, they'll be nice to you in return." And he's like this endless font of sort of homiletic or cliche wisdom. And always, oh, the grass is greener on the other side. Always it's sort of kind and folksy and whatnot. And at the same time, he is burning inwardly with these impulses towards violence and destructiveness. And it is a slow burn towards a catastrophic explosion, which leaves an awful lot of casualties. They did a great job of filming it. Recommend the film. Most of all, though, I recommend the book. It's terrific. So now I want to turn to a genre which is truly dark, right? And if you do not have the stomach for this, just tune me out for a second. But there are a number of serial killers, convicted serial killers, who have written fairly extensive books while they were in prison. And they're absolutely horrifying in the matter-of-fact way that they deal with acts of absolute depravity. The strangest one by far, is by Ian Brady, who in the 1960s, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady kidnapped, tortured, filmed, and killed children, and is famous for the burying of the bodies in the moors. So he's called the Moors Murderer. That's his sort of badge of infamy. But he was a smart guy. Some serial killers are smart guy in terms of IQ, and he writes this hell of a book called The Gates of Janus. Now, again, I am not recommending this if you don't have a strong stomach, but the book is called Serial Killing and Its Analysis by the Moors Murderer, Ian Brady. And part of it is his attempt to combine the thoughts of Friedrich Nietzsche. Terrible misinterpretation, right? He does not understand Nietzsche, but specifically Nietzsche's ideas of will to power and Übermensch, and he combines them with ideas of Marquis de Sade and says, look, if I have the character not to care what society thinks, why should I be subject to the same pedestrian laws that everyone else is? I am myself alone, just like Richard III's declaration. And he makes a case not for immorality, but amorality. Why should I possibly care? It is absolutely harrowing. To give you an idea of the kind of writing that's in there, everyone who writes about true crime or anyone who is a fan of detective fiction is always absolutely fascinated by this sort of shadowy blurring of pursuer and prey, of detective and criminal. In the world of modern profiling, there's almost this uncanny blurring where you have the very people who invented the process of modern criminal profiling actively trying to walk in the footsteps of the criminals themselves. And it is an absolutely harrowing kind of thing. And these people, that maybe the biggest single revolution in detecting serious crimes happened in Quantico when the lackluster behavioral science group, which was mostly concerned with dealing with successfully negotiating hostage situations, suddenly became infused with new blood. And some of them thought that, oh, it would be really smart to start actually interviewing people who were criminals. We'll both start reading more psychology, and we'll go and we'll interview these people who have killed multiple victims and learned a tremendous amount in the process of interviewing, and so developed a kind of methodology for looking at the characteristics which killers seem to share. Fantastic thing, but their the actual utilization of those skills and that knowledge by a profiler is nothing. They say again and again, it's not something you can read in books. You actually have to walk in the steps in an imaginary sort of empath sense with the killer and the victim to understand the totality of the crime. And that is one scary thing to do. But writers do it all the time. Probably not as well as a Robert Ressler but this is something that Ian Brady writes about, and this is from Brady's book. The serial killer and the detective, and I'm quoting now, the serial killer and the detective, to a significant extent, necessarily share many characteristics, including a common unorthodox philosophy in tandem with solitary dedication and commitment. So how weird to have someone who's serving a life sentence and has taken away multiple lives. How freaky weird to have them writing about this stuff. But with solitary dedication and commitment, both protagonists must be ruthless in purpose, astute in deceit, clear in strategy, temper self-confidence with caution, and cultivate doubt where there is certainty and certainty where there is doubt. They must feign incompetence to provoke overconfidence. They must nourish arrogance by fake humility, deny, affirm, and divert with dexterity as tactics dictate. Incite anger to obtain the unguarded response and sow confusion. Okay, for a killer, an incarcerated multiple sex crime killer to be writing a sentence like, they must incite anger to obtain the unguarded response and sow confusion, exude sympathetic sympathy, right? Sympathetic sympathy for trust while doubting everyone. This uncanny and weird and spooky, right? You always have to ask, where are these voices coming from? This is coming from a prison cell and someone who would, flunk the hair scale, flunk every sort of cluster B disorder, and be as firmly grounded in sort of psychopath as anyone, and who has ruined multiple lives. 5 victims really mean 50 victims, because every single person who is murdered leaves so many mourning people behind him. And you get these bizarre, somewhat interesting sentences: must excite anger to obtain the unguarded response and sow confusion, exude synthetic sympathy for trust while doubting everyone, regard all individuals as essentially corrupt and guided by self-interest, live and breathe moral and legal relativism while projecting moral and legal rectitude. And above all, as already postulated, believe and act in the certainty that the end always justifies the means. Well, the scary thing is that you apply that as a kind of credo to a successful detective. I think it's freaking spot on, right? You shift and say, this is the credo of a smart, successful serial killer. Ooh, that is smart on too. And it's sort of a template to how to avoid detection. It's just strange to me beyond words, but that is the Moore's murderer. And he goes on to do these profiles of various notorious killers, including, let's see, Henry Lee Lucas and John Wayne Gacy, Robert Ramirez, Ted Bundy, the Green River Killer. And you know what? They're kind of interesting profiles, right? The Gacy one is just absolutely harrowing. Well, you'd think he's the only one serial killer who's written books. No. An even worse one, and this one you need an even stronger stomach for, is Gerard Schaefer, right? And he was known as a fairly intelligent, good-natured, smiling sheriff's deputy, right? There's that smile and be a villain thing again. But in July of 1972, Schaefer pulled off his first murder attempt, and using his authority as a police officer, he convinced hitchhikers Pamela Wells and Nancy Trotter that hitchhiking was illegal, picked them up in his squad car, wound up driving them to the beach, and then to a swamp, ties them to a tree at gunpoint. Well, they escape, and he winds up getting caught for this. and in prison for a little under a year. But while he was in prison, detectives found there were other crimes which matched this crime, and so he was ultimately arrested for murders for which he was convicted. But we really don't know, we really do not know how many people he killed. When the cops went to his house, actually it wasn't his house, it was his mother's house, which is always a little bit weird, but they found, as well as a number of graphic images, short stories about murders that Schaefer had written. I'm stuttering here because along with finding 11 guns and 13 knives, the stories were so awful. The stories start out completely matter of fact, like one is called Spring Break, and you have slightly older than student age fella going to a spring break town in Florida, and everyone's all boozed up and whatnot, and he's a good looking fellow, and he comes in and has a flirtation with someone, and it's sort of par for the course for a bar flirtation. And then suddenly they're about to be intimate, and his knife comes out, and you realize with a sinking heart that you are about to see her dying, represented with the same sort of clarity that the whole seduction was. And this was a seduction not towards love, but towards murder. It's scary stuff. And so criminologists have pored over the stories and tried to figure out how much might be modeled on other crimes. But it is a horrifying, horrifying book. Insightful, though, because we're getting a glimpse of a psychotic personality writing what he thinks are really clever stories about murdering people. And the images are pretty grim, too. There's another one, if you've got the stomach for serial killer writers. Danny Rowling wrote something called The Making of the Serial Killer, and he was horrifying. That's the Gainesville student murderer, and that's in his own words, and it's just horrifying. Apparently, John Wayne Gacy wrote a book too, but it was released in such limited edition. I have not managed to acquire a form, acquire a copy of it. Okay, I'm going to add one more thing and then stop. Next week, again, I'll be talking about the Michael Stone books. And then the week after that, I'm doing something called Watching the Detective, which I'm really looking forward to, which actually, thanks to a friend named Beckham, is about sort of the history of detective fiction, but specifically the way that has impacted the actual science and practice of detection in real life, which is a very, very interesting topic and one I've been thinking about for a long time. Want to add one more thing. At some point, I will talk about the whole Quantico group, who really originated this whole modern science of profiling. I find the story fascinating. You've probably seen things about it on TV. There was a series about it. But the key players are John Douglas and Robert Ressler. Robert Ressler did the book Whoever Fights Monsters, taking the quote from Friedrich Nietzsche for his title, "If you gaze into the abyss will gaze back in you. Whoever fights monsters is going to find the monstrous in themselves." Roy Hazelwood, who's absolutely fascinating because the entire FBI, he was the specialist in violent sexual crimes. And he wrote a book called Dark Dreams, which is just astonishingly insightful. And he is one of these people who would do profiling where he would have to get inside the minds of the darkest sort of people. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not himself become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back at you. Well, that's the challenge that profilers have. I think I will let it go at that. Except here is Robert Ressler talking. First chapter, Inside the Mind of the Killer. Put yourself in the position of the hunter. That's what I have to do every day at work. Think of one of those nature films, a lion in the Serengeti plain in Africa. He sees this huge herd of antelope at a watering hole, but somehow we can see it in his eyes. The lion locks on to a single one out of those thousands of animals. He's trained himself to sense weakness, vulnerability. Something different in one antelope out of the entire herd makes it the most likely victim. Then in a summary says, when we teach the elements of criminal personality profiling and crime scene analysis to FBI agents or law enforcement professionals, we try to get them to think of the entire story of the crime. My colleague, Roy Hazelwood, who taught the basic profiling course for several years before retiring from the Bureau in '93, used to divide the analysis into 3 distinct questions and phrases. What, why, and who? What took place? This includes everything that might be behaviorally significant about the crime. And why did it happen the way it did? Why, for example, was there mutilation after death? Why was nothing of value taken? Why was there no forced entry? What are the reasons for every behaviorally significant factor in the crime? And this then leads to who would have committed this crime for these reasons? That is the question the profiler asks themselves. All right, whoever fights monsters, Jim Thompson, The Killer Inside Me, books all the way back in 1941, carving out a sort of model of psychopathic behavior that seems every bit as relevant and insightful as what we are getting these days. I hope you have a great afternoon, and thank you.